All right, now we are in Sensors Class, Chapter 13 review. I'm going to go pretty quickly. Chapter 13 talks about mechanical level systems. Now, all of y'all should be used to and see in daily use certain mechanical level systems. And when we get to that, they should be really blindingly obvious. However, Chapter 13 starts off with some really broad discussions of things. It talks about level measurement in overall standpoint. We talk about the different systems and kind of tanks that we need to measure the level of. Level measurement used to be, in the old days, very eyeball oriented. You would just make sure you had enough of whatever you needed in that tank to produce the product that you want to run that day. And so all you really had to do was pop open the cover of tank, look down inside and say, yep, I got some of that. Pop it closed and fire up your process. But now in the last 40 years, our processes have become more and more automated, and we can't rely on eyeballing the levels anymore. We need to develop systems that automatically not only determine the exact level, but determine the exact change in level if I've run a manufacturing process. So they have to be a lot more precise, and they have to be a lot more broadly used and integrated to control systems. So at the beginning of this book, it talks about just the concept of tanks. What is a tank? And they give you sort of general descriptions of them, and then they show you this picture of different tank configurations. All of these should be tanks you've seen in general use here and there. And a lot of these discussion is talking about some of the challenges in measuring the level of various tanks, especially if you don't have a perfectly round or cylindrical tank. If you've got a rounded bottom tank, you might get a level, but that doesn't tell you that you've got the same volume for every inch of level. You might lose a lot of that volume down at the bottom of the tank. So there's some overall discussions here of what a point level measurement is. That is a discrete measurement. That's using an on-off signal to your PLC. It's saying that I have reached a certain particular level in a tank. A typical example of this is your toilet, which is a level system pretty much in everybody's house. Your toilet's got a valve hooked to a float. When that valve, basically that float drops because the tank is emptied into your toilet, then it kicks open the valve and your tank fills up again. When it reaches the float kind of, the tank fills up, the float rises, it reaches the top point of its arc, it'll turn off that valve. That on-off function is called a discrete or point level measurement. And we have a lot of different kind of discrete point level measurements. Usually they're used for alarms or on-off or basic functions like that. So the book talks about some old school visual inspections. So you're going to learn about gauge glasses, which is nothing more than a piece of glass used on the side of the tank that let you read the tank level. And if it's something that might break and cause a huge mess if it breaks, or danger if it breaks, we used armored gauge glasses. Reflex gauge glasses are the same as other types of gauge glasses, but they tend to use a special kind of glass that reflects or refracts the light to make it easier to read the level. We've got a bunch of other gauge systems in here. For instance, you can have a mechanical float in a tube that runs up and down the side of the tank. They show a little picture of that here. In that little magnetic float, it's got a little magnet on it, will cause a little floating bob to rise and fall in a little tray or a little kind of rack next to the tube that holds the float. So that way, as the float rises, you see the level rise. This is very old school, old-fashioned methods. We have similar systems with cables and weights. So these are all very old school systems. We also have old school systems that use pressure, hydrostatic pressure, to determine the level inside that tank. This is the cable and weight system. So hydrostatic pressure, we can put a pressure gauge at the bottom of the tank, and by calculating back the weight of, in this case, it's probably water above, we get that head, that height above the measurement point, that'll tell us how much liquid we have in there. So that's a very classic way of measuring the tank level, is look at the pressure at the bottom of the tank. And we also talk about modified pressure cells, which also can measure pressure by attaching these cells to different levels in the tank and looking at the differential pressure. All right, so I went through very quickly through those. Those are just simple uses of pressure, which we went over a lot to determine the tank height or the tank level. Now we're going to dive into something called bubblers. Now, I'm on page 140 in the book. I think bubblers are great because they're very inexpensive. They're a very cheap way, and they kind of use a cool technology to determine tank level, and it's self-cleaning. I really like them because they're self-cleaning, and you can use them in very, very dirty tanks. In fact, the best example of a bubbler I ever saw was in a septic system. It's actually a citywide septic system, and they're measuring sewage level in a tank. And so they're using a bubbler because it's constantly cleaning itself. They don't have to worry about any gunk getting up inside of it. So a bubbler is a great way of determining tank level. And let me go share my screen here. And we're going to talk about a bubbler. Now I'm jumping over to my PowerPoint presentation I mentioned earlier. And a bubbler, basically, very, very simple, is a pressure gauge attached to a pipe that goes down to the bottom of the tank. And what you do is you put compressed air into that pipe and you crack open the valve for that compressed air, so just enough air pushes down this pipe so that it comes out the bottom in bubbles, right? And the cool thing about this system is the pressure will stabilize at the point where the bubbles are able to burst out of the bottom of that pipe. And that stabilized pressure then is the same as measuring the pressure at the bottom of the tank. It's just like putting a pressure gauge at the very bottom of the tank. But you can do this with dirty water and sewage and anything you want. And you don't have to drill a hole in your tank. You could do it in the bottom of a concrete tank. You can do it in the bottom of a well. You can do it in anything. All you need is a tube that goes down to the bottom of whatever you're measuring the height of. So it's a very, very cheap and efficient way of measuring pressure, simply by just applying a little bit of compressed air into a tube and then measuring the pressure of that tube. So that's a very, very cool use of Pascal's law, and it's a very cheap way of doing it. So I've got a link in Bubblers. It's easy, cheap, no moving parts, repeatable, and it's not really suitable for pressurized tanks. It only really works in open air tanks. And if there's gravel or sediment or dirt at the bottom of the tank, the tube goes down into it, it won't work so well anymore. But it's a very, very nice, inexpensive way to do things. So let's go on with this chapter 13. They have a couple drawings of the bubblers, which I think are great. And it shows you methods of doing this. These are also automated, and I've given you a link to a bubbler that you can purchase very cheaply and measure tank levels. So on page 141, we get into floats and displacers. They are two separate things. A float is simply a float that kind of rides on top of the liquid, and it's usually liquid. And when the float goes up, we know that the liquid goes up. The float goes down, the liquid goes down. So you usually attach an arm to your float, and I think on the next page, we've got an example of a float system, like your toilet. And that float can be an on-off system like your toilet, or you can hook it to a dial gauge to look at your tank level. The gas tank in many people's vehicles is on a dial gauge style float system like this. The older vehicles. I think the newer vehicles use something semi-electronic, but the older vehicles have a very simple system like this. We also have something called a tape float level, where the float rides up and down inside the tank, and then a tape on the outside moves up and down to give you your exact tank level. A displacer is very similar to a float, but instead of having a float that rides up and down with the tank level, a displacer is just a big kind of usually filled with air or some sort of gas kind of bubble, or kind of, in this case, a cylinder that rides down inside the tank. And so the more liquid in the tank, the more it presses upward. So the more upward displacement you have against a dial gauge, a spring of some sort. And that upward displacement that can be read in terms of a dial, which gives you your tank height. And here they've got a little picture of what one of those are. On page 145, we've got what we call paddle wheel switches, which are nothing more than a little spinning paddle wheel when it hits whatever's in the tank, and it's usually done with some sort of aggregate or some sort of loose material like sand or granules or whatever. And when the paddle wheel hits, you've got something solid in there hitting against. So that's pretty much it for